Okay, so we have all the equipment that we need here to invest. I just want to point out a few things. We have a fawn stock. I have a toothbrush with soft bristles, so we clean off the teeth with a wax later on. A plaster knife, a spatula, and a bowl. Our compress with the Allen key and the handle. And I have a Vaseline container, and I usually use a denture brush to apply the Vaseline onto the flasks. And I have a separating fluid with a soft brush. Okay, before we start, a couple of things you want to keep in mind. If you see the countertop now, it looks pretty clean, but this is not always the case. So to prevent some issues from happening and possibly getting some stone debris, especially where the flasks need to be flush with each other. Just a good habit to get into. What I tend to do when I open my flasks, I turn my lid upside down and I place the master cast there. The second half of the flask, I don't let it touch the bench completely. I rest it on the lid itself, and I tend to keep the upper on my right side and the lower on the left. Okay? If you notice, the lower flask here has an incline versus the lower is pretty parallel to the bench, and the reason is this is to accommodate the height of the retromolar pads here on the posterior portion of the cast. All right, the first thing we want to do is we want to apply some Vaseline onto the flask, except the lid. We want that to stick to the stone. So I'm gonna put some gloves on, and you can certainly use just your fingers to apply the Vaseline, but I like to use just an old denture brush that I can scoop up some Vaseline and smear a generous amount, but keep it relatively thin. Try not to leave any clumps. A nice even coat of Vaseline on the lower and as well as on the upper half of the flasks. Get it all the way inside the little holes. You really don't want stone adhering to the flasks at all. And you want to coat the inside of the flasks and on the underside as well as the top. And again, this doesn't have to be extremely neat. Just make sure you apply an ample amount and keep it relatively thin. And again, I'm going to rest it on the lid. And also around the little prongs here, as well as on the top. You really don't have to put it on the outside, but you happen to get some there, it's quite okay. Okay, I'm gonna rest that there. And the next step, I'm just gonna clean off a little bit of the Vaseline from my hands. And I'm going to apply some separating fluid on the master cast. You don't have to apply separating fluid on top of the land area right now, just on the outside and on the bottom portion of the cast. So once again, make sure that the separating fluid is at a nice consistency. If the separating fluid has been left open to dry a bit, you might want to introduce some more water to thin out the fluid, but try to use fresh separating fluid from a new batch so you have the same consistency, especially when we're separating the rest of the case later on. So I'm going to let that to rest. So we're going to apply a nice coat, even coat of separating fluid around the cast as well as on the bottom. You do not require to put any separating fluid now. You will have to do it later, but I think out of good habit, I would do it now, just in case you splash some investment over. And I'm gonna let that rest and dry. So the next step would be to invest the case. You can certainly do it at the same time, but if you're new at this, I would suggest you start one at a time, and certainly start with the upper because it's a little bit easier to invest versus the lower because you got a bit of a height here over the richer molder pads. Okay, so I'm going to mix some stone in here, half and half, half plaster, half stone, and just enough to accommodate this model, which is not a lot. So I think a cup worth of stone and plaster should do the trick. So I have 50-50 mix between stone and plaster. I'm gonna add some water to it. And make sure that when you're mixing it, that you